714. That is how many prairie dogs they loaded into crates one cold morning and carried out onto a stretch of Colorado ground that, for most of the 20th century, was considered one of the most poisoned places in all of America. Not poisoned as a figure of speech, poisoned in the most literal, chemical, measurable sense there is. This was land where the United States Army had manufactured mustard agent and nerve gas, where a chemical company had then spent decades brewing industrial pesticides, where the groundwater had been so saturated with toxins that it was blamed for killing crops on neighboring farms and corroding the equipment that touched it. 1 square mile of it had been described, without much exaggeration, as the most polluted square mile on the entire planet. And into that ground, onto that exact wound in the map, someone released 714 small, burrowing rodents, and then walked away and waited. The people who did it were hoping for something modest. They were hoping that enough of the animals would dig in, find food, and survive a single Rocky Mountain winter to keep the colony from blinking out. That is not what happened. Survival, it turned out, was the least remarkable thing these animals would do. Because what those prairie dogs did to that dead ground over the years that followed, and what came back to live there because of them, is something the biologists who manage that land still describe with a kind of quiet disbelief. I'm Harold Calder, and this is the story of how the single most hated rodent in North America walked into a former chemical weapons site and rebuilt an entire living prairie from the soil upward, and in doing so handed a home back to an animal the world had already declared extinct. But before you can understand what the prairie dogs did, you have to throw out almost everything you think you know about them, because the creature you are picturing right now is wrong. When most people hear prairie dog, they picture a pest, a varmint, a hole in a field that might snap a cow's leg, a nuisance to be shot on a weekend or gassed out by the county. For more than a century, that is exactly how this animal was classified, and it is the reason for nearly everything that was done to it. But that picture has the truth almost perfectly inverted. The prairie dog is not a pest on the grassland. It is the thing that builds the grassland. Ecologists have a term for an animal like this. They call it a keystone species, meaning a species that holds an entire ecosystem together, whose presence or absence ripples up and down through every other living thing around it. And the prairie dog earns that title in a way few animals on the continent can match. Start underground. A prairie dog colony is not a scatter of holes. It is a vast engineered structure, a network of tunnels and chambers that punches down through soil so compacted that rain used to simply run off the top of it. Those tunnels aerate the ground. They open channels that carry rainwater down into the earth instead of letting it sheet away, recharging the moisture the whole system drinks from. Above ground, the animals clip the tall grass low and keep it cropped, which sounds like damage until you realize what it does. The constantly trimmed vegetation around a colony grows back younger, greener, and far richer in protein than the rank grass beyond it, and that patch of high-quality forage pulls in the big grazers, the pronghorn, and the bison that the prairie needs. And then there are the burrows themselves, because a prairie dog is forever digging new ones and abandoning old ones, and every abandoned burrow becomes real estate for something else. Burrowing owls, little long-legged owls that cannot dig and must borrow a hole to nest in, move in. Snakes move in, salamanders, insects, and a small, ferocious, critically endangered predator we will get to very soon all move in. By some counts, more than 150 other species are tied directly to the prairie dog town. Pull the prairie dog out, and all of that quietly comes apart. And here is the detail that genuinely stops people. These animals talk. For decades, a biologist named Kon Slobodchikov at Northern Arizona University recorded and decoded their alarm calls. And what he found is that a prairie dog does not simply bark a generic warning. Its calls appear to encode the kind of predator approaching, and astonishingly, the apparent size, the color, even the speed of an individual human walking toward the colony. It may be one of the most information-dense systems of natural communication ever documented in a wild mammal. Hold on to that, because it matters later. So this was never a pest. This was the Keystone, and we spent a century knocking it out. The war on the prairie dog was deliberate and it was enormous. As ranching spread across the plains, the animal was reclassified as vermin, a competitor for grass, and the killing was industrialized. Strychnine first, then compounds with names like 1080 and zinc phosphide poured into burrows across the West. To grasp the scale of what was lost, consider that a single prairie dog town in Texas, surveyed at the turn of the 20th century, was estimated to hold around 400 million animals across some 25,000 square miles. Across the Great Plains as a whole, biologists estimate the prairie dog was reduced by 95% or more. And then, as if the poison were not enough, came a second blow the animal had never evolved to survive: Sylvatic plague. The bacterium is Yersinia pestis, the very same organism that caused the Black Death in medieval Europe, and it arrived on North American shores around the year 1900 and spilled out of port cities into the wild rodents of the West. Prairie dogs have almost no resistance to it. A bustling colony of thousands can fall completely silent in a matter of weeks, 90 to 100% of the animals dead. Between the poison campaigns and the plague, the keystone of the American grassland was simply switched off across most of the country, and the particular patch of Colorado where our story begins had a third catastrophe stacked on top of the other two. In 1942, the Army built a facility outside Denver to manufacture chemical weapons for the war, mustard agent, and later the nerve agent the world would come to know as sarin. When the war ended, the weapons work continued through the Cold War, and a chemical company leased part of the site to mass-produce agricultural pesticides. For decades, the toxic waste from all of it was dumped into open, unlined basins in the ground. The contamination went so deep and so wide that in 1987 the site was formally declared a federal Superfund site, the designation the United States reserves for the most hazardous contaminated land in the entire country. By every reasonable expectation, this was a dead place, a sacrifice zone, a square of the map you write off forever. And then someone looked up and noticed the eagles. Because no human was permitted onto the contaminated land, it had become, by accident, one of the most undisturbed open spaces on the Colorado Front Range, and a large communal roost of bald eagles had begun wintering in the cottonwoods there. The poison, perversely, had made it a sanctuary. That single observation helped set something in motion that nobody had planned, and in 1992, while the cleanup was still underway, the old weapons site was designated a National Wildlife Refuge. What followed was one of the largest environmental restorations ever attempted: billions of dollars, years of excavating and capping and hauling away poisoned earth. But the people rebuilding that prairie ran straight into a problem that money alone cannot solve. You can plant native grass, you can even truck in bison, and they did exactly that. But a grassland is not just grass and big animals walking on it. A grassland needs its engineer. It needs the creature that turns flat, dead, compacted dirt into a three-dimensional, irrigated, aerated, inhabited machine. It needs the prairie dog, which is why, onto that healing wound of a landscape, they brought 714 of them. And everyone who understood the stakes held their breath, because the founding number was small, the ground was still recovering, and plague was never more than a single infected flea away. And then the animals did what the animal does. They dug. They drove their tunnels down through the hardpan, and the rain that had always sheeted off the surface began, for the first time in a long time, to sink in. The clipped vegetation around the colonies greened into exactly the young, protein-rich forage the grazers wanted. The burrowing owls found the empty burrows and moved in. The colony became a town, and the town became a complex spreading across the refuge. Pronghorn drifted in to graze the fresh growth. Hawks began circling the open ground because a prairie dog town is also a buffet, and a buffet draws hunters. Ground-nesting birds returned to country that had been silent. Piece by piece, in an order no manager dictated, the system was reassembling itself around the diggers at the center of it. The prairie was switching back on. But the part nobody quite lets themselves expect is what came next, because it is the part that turns a nice restoration story into something close to a resurrection. I need to tell you about the black-footed ferret. It is North America's most endangered mammal, the only ferret native to this continent, a slim, masked, nocturnal hunter of the grassland, and by the end of the 1970s it was believed to be extinct, gone, mourned in the scientific literature. And then, in 1981, on a ranch near Meeteetse, Wyoming, a dog named Shep killed a strange animal in the night and carried it home, and when people looked at the body, they realized they were holding a living black-footed ferret. A tiny, last hidden population was found nearby, and for a moment it looked like a reprieve. It was almost the opposite. Within a few years, that little population was itself crashing, hit by disease tearing through the animals and the plague tearing through the prairie dogs they fed on, and biologists made an agonizing call. They captured the survivors, every last one they could find, and pulled the entire species into captivity, betting that a hand-run breeding program was the only thing standing between the black-footed ferret and final, permanent extinction. Every single black-footed ferret alive on Earth today descends from roughly 18 animals, only 7 of which became genetic founders, a species threaded through an eye of the needle about as narrow as any on the planet. And here is the thread that ties this entire story into one knot. The black-footed ferret eats almost nothing but prairie dogs, around 90% of its diet, and it lives inside prairie dog burrows, hunting them through the dark underground. No prairie dogs, no ferrets. No, it is not difficult to reintroduce the ferret without a prairie dog colony. It is impossible. The ferret cannot exist on ground the prairie dog has not already built, which is why, in 2015, biologists were able to do a thing that would have sounded like fantasy a generation before. They released black-footed ferrets, among the rarest mammals in the world, onto the old chemical weapons ground, onto the exact foundation those 714 prairie dogs had spent years constructing. The most poisoned square mile in America had become one of the few places left wild enough and engineered enough to host the homecoming of a species we had already grieved. Now, I want to be honest about the parts of this that are uncertain and the parts that are not yet won, because the version of this story that flattens it into a tidy miracle does it a disservice. The Keystone science is solid, and study after study finds the same pattern, that removing prairie dogs collapses the community around them and restoring them lets it reassemble. The communication research is more contested, and I want to be careful here. Not every biologist accepts the strongest claims about prairie dog language, and that work was done on a different prairie dog species than the one in our story. And the recovery itself is fragile in a way that should not be hidden. Plague has not gone anywhere. A single outbreak can still wipe out a colony, and every ferret that depends on it, in a matter of weeks, which is why crews now dust burrows with insecticide to kill the fleas that carry it, and field test an oral plague vaccine dropped as bait for the animals to eat. It is a holding action, not a final victory. And beyond the refuge fence, the prairie dog is still treated as a pest across much of its range, still poisoned and still shot, so that the very animal rebuilding a wasteland in one place is being gassed out of a pasture 50 miles away. Both of those things are true at the same time, and an honest telling has to hold them both. So step back and look at the whole shape of it. We spent the better part of a century engineering this one piece of ground, first into a factory for weapons designed to kill, then into a poisoned ruin nobody wanted, and finally into a refuge we tried, with enormous effort and enormous budgets, to rebuild with our own hands. And the thing that actually rebuilt it, in the end, was not a plan or a budget or a machine. It was a small, plump, much despised rodent we had spent that same century trying to wipe off the map. We did not restore the prairie. We returned the Keystone, and then we got out of its way. 714 animals dropped onto the most poisoned square mile in America, a creature we poisoned by the hundreds of millions, an engineer we mistook for a pest, carrying on its back the comeback of the most endangered mammal on the continent. If this changed the way you see the least glamorous animal on the prairie, let me know in the comments. And tell me whether you think we should be protecting the prairie dog as the keystone it actually is, or whether the conflicts with ranching and development are too real to wave away. If it moved you, share it with someone who would appreciate it. And subscribe, because there are more of these comeback stories than you would ever guess, and I have got plenty more to tell you. I'm Harold Calder. Thanks for watching.